Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Since we are the sweeper team, may I ask that everyone takes their rubbish with them when they leave the room afterwards, please? But what we'll do in the meantime, and I guess we've got, 20 minutes or so to go through this, I thought we'd run through the things that we've heard today very quickly, try to generate more discussion and responses if you haven't been able to be in the queue a bit earlier, and then think of the way forward. Where are we going from here, effectively? Does that sound like a plan? Mm-hmm. Okay, so effectively, earlier this morning, that was quite some time ago, we heard Margaret James MP providing the government support for the multi-stakeholder model, and she touched on the making of the UK internet a safe internet for all users, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, Internet of Things, IoT security by design, effective data protection rules, quite a full speech. So I guess when she touched on the comments from Macron, she explained that the call by Macron for more regulation was a good call, but emphasizes, though, that the UK will contribute to that dialogue through advocating dialogue with all stakeholders, support work of IGF and strengthen the local IGF, and also making sure that the data flows are not adversely impacted by Brexit. Then we heard from Carrie Lawler from Generation Z. I didn't even know that Generation Z existed, but can't remember what generation we were from, finds that AI is often portrayed negatively in the news. And we just heard a little bit earlier about AI and so on, and well, it showed that young people are not only interested, but also eager to be involved with the future of AI. Then we had a session on online safety, with a safe internet session, and the big question was who decides what is hate speech? And instead of asking this question, it was mentioned that there should be distinguishing levels of severity of hate speech: genocide, hostility and violence, national security or public order, intolerance, etc., a whole pyramid. And then regarding the severity, technology will not solve all the problems, but there needs to be education in society. Some participants said that if there is no law on hate speech, the platforms need to carry out responsibility on content. The London School of Economics launched an independent platform on content responsibility, and platforms are already taking all kinds of action on content. Transparent, accountable, fair, and inclusive as to who can influence that process. And civil society, we were told, is unfortunately rarely or never included in the platform solutions that are currently being used. So what do we want to achieve? Well, we want to minimize the issuance of hate speech, but are the existing laws capable to address this? And sometimes hate speech is being used to shut down legitimate discourse. It's not just a simple scenario of yes, it is, or no, it isn't. Keywords for the next thing. Oh, one tweet actually did come out, and that shocked a number of people, supposedly, was whether children have to protect themselves and have to be subjected to hate speech and to all sorts of things to self-protect. For anybody that's got children, I'm not quite sure that's the sort of thing that they would like to see. Two options. On the one hand, you can have a ban on hate speech. On the other side, you can have some kind of a measured response. What happens when you have to make a decision on what is allowed and what is not allowed? And there was a push for independent oversight of the process that was requested by some panelists. And I think that was probably the only agreement we had on this specific topic, where everyone agreed to agree, I guess. Anyway, algorithm bias was the next topic that we had, and we had a good lecture from Ansgar on this, a good backgrounder. And immediately afterwards, the session on mapping the process of GDPR, with the UK being in a transitional phase with regard to GDPR. And we were told that the UK is currently well placed when it comes to compliance compared with a few years ago. I guess it's probably the case with many countries. UK appears to be on track for a harmonious transition of data protection regarding data processing when it comes down to Brexit. And we'll have more insight on this after March 2019, apparently. So the next session was on countering data exploitation. And some data brokers often exploit data against the various principles of data protection. And this type of information is used by a lot of organizations, from private sector all the way to the police, in order to be able to profile people. And the question is, what should people do to protect themselves? The onus should not be on individuals, but on the law to actually implement to be implemented in a way that protects people's rights. A regulatory authority has a role to play, and one of the last questions that was asked there was, does the GDPR properly address concerns about data protection in the UK? After that, we had reporting from ITU Plenipot and IGF 2018, unfortunately cut short a little bit, so if you do have further questions on this, we still have Desiree in the room. And moving on to the cybersecurity and the Internet of Things security by design. But since we haven't got that much time, I do have about 20 lines on this, but that's just happened now, so I gather you probably have caught the gist of the discussions, and it's still fresh in your mind, even though we did have a goldfish bowl earlier on the stage. Just comparing things with the Swiss IGF, which I attended a couple of days ago, it's interesting, the topics at the Swiss IGF were different. They had something on e-voting and digital democracy. As you might or might not know, Switzerland runs a lot of referendums. So as far as they're concerned, being able to bring all of this online is something that will help, or that they see as being helpful to developing democracy, further democratic processes. There was a small section talking about GDPR and privacy. And they actually called it the digital human. How do I use, maintain, and protect my digital self? So looking at it maybe from a slightly different point of view. And there was a suggestion that people might need multiple digital identities. I was rather surprised, but the idea, I guess, is that on the one hand, you would use one identity for legal business like banking, e-banking, etc. And on the other, you'd have a different identity or a different type of identity for other things like gaming and so on, so as to not have all your eggs in one basket. And the lunchtime session was talking about network barring, so blocking of networks and differentiation between blocking that was voluntary agreed and welcome by users and blocking or filtering that was imposed on users with a reference to the Swiss online gaming law. So very different topics in Switzerland. The committee here tried to put together something that was going to resonate with the audience, I guess, in the UK. And we'd like to hear from you whether this was a good program or not, or whether you have any concerns on how we can improve things. And I guess I can turn over to David, because he can talk to us about the future, perhaps.
Well, what I thought I'd try to do was talk about, was plan 5 themes which have come out of the day today, which might also be important themes over the coming year and which we may wish to talk about in 12 months' time. And also, I'm encouraged to be a bit provocative, so let's see whether I manage that. So the first of my themes is to do with risks and harms associated with the internet. I think the overall topic for this particular event was meant to be solutions, I believe, but actually most of the sessions talked about risks, about cybersecurity, online safety, data exploitation, and so forth. And I find this increasingly the case at internet events. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was at a lecture in Oxford given by Vince Cerf, the university's most prestigious lecturer of the year. And I came away from that thinking, this is Google's chief internet doomsayer, not Google's chief internet evangelist. So the tone of this discussion is essentially moved from being a lot of it from being about opportunities towards harms. And I think 3 things came out from the discussion today around that I think we'll be thinking more of. First, that the parameters of the internet reach beyond established laws and norms and therefore require rethinking of laws and norms. Second, that the issues that we are discussing are complex, nuanced issues which require complex, nuanced approaches, not binary choices, particularly in areas like online safety. And third, this is not about policy alone, it's also about practice, including the issue that was in the last session of shared responsibility. So I think that's my first theme that will not go away, but will be here and more important next year. And my second is changing governance and the role of regulation. So I'll start here with 2 quotations. The Minister, security should be built in from the outset. Also from DCMS, Andrew Honeyman, that platforms, which are obviously now extremely important, are not constrained by transparency and accountability. And the implication of that is that we need to rethink aspects of governance that we've kind of taken for granted, I think, over the past, even up to 20 years. In particular, I think we need to think whether and where the balance of opportunity and risk requires a more precautionary approach. So examples of where we have a more precautionary approach, I would say, would include GDPR and data protection. They would include the DCMS goal of ensuring that IoT should be secure by design. They include actually thinking about, as Stephen Patterson pointed out, the number of lines of code in an autonomous vehicle, thinking about how we ensure that the code that governs autonomous vehicles is fit for purpose. So what's the objective overall here? It's a familiar one, I think, which is a framework that balances the enabling of innovation with the protection of citizens, the protection of networks, the security of networks. And it's not a new challenge, nor is it exclusive to the internet. I find myself in discussions at Oxford about genetic engineering in this context quite often as well. Are there new regulatory models? I think Sonia Livingston suggests one, which is from the Truth, Trust and Technology Commission from the LSE, published this week, of an independent platform agency. It's something worth thinking through and discussing further. I wouldn't go further than that at the moment. So my third area, perhaps less discussed today, but important, is the relationship between multilateral and multi-stakeholder approaches. Here too, I think that the changes in the nature of the information society and internet governance debates require us to think differently, perhaps. It's affected by the growth of digital dominance and the very powerful global corporations, the fact that many internet governance decisions are now taken inside boardrooms. Perhaps I think that the way in which this discussion, which again I see in many different internet fora, is moving is towards a notion that we need to recalibrate the equilibrium between multi-stakeholder and multilateral approaches, to make that reflect the requirements of a digital society which is emerging rather than the requirements of the digital society that originated a multi-stakeholder approach 20 years ago. So I think at the IGF in Paris last week, both Secretary General Guterres and President Macron were trying to address this, and both made substantive contributions to it, which we need to think about. The other thing I draw attention to for the next year is the Internet and Jurisdiction Project, international project, which will report, which is meeting in Berlin to reach a conclusion in, I think, June, which is exploring issues of the relationship between the global internet and national jurisdictions, including issues such as extraterritoriality. And I think that will be worth our discussing in a year's time. My fourth theme is that the transition from the internet to a wider digital society, whom I'm increasingly using myself in preference to information society, which is to do with issues around artificial intelligence, algorithmic decision-making, big data, and so forth, in which, too, there are opportunities and risks, and which I find myself engaged in increasingly. Earlier this week at UNESCO, discussing artificial intelligence. Next week, supporting a New Zealand Commission of Inquiry into artificial intelligence and its impact on New Zealand. I'm recollecting being told some 7 or 8 years ago in an interview with one of, let's say, the gurus of the internet, that perhaps the internet was just a passing phase on the way to a broader digital agenda. And I think that's where we are now. We're actually moving away from the internet towards a broader digitalization agenda, and we need to think about it in a different way. So the UN now has a high-level panel on digital cooperation. That will also report by the time we meet again at the UK IGF. And I think that perhaps we ought to recognize that what we are in fact now is something more like a digital society governance forum than an internet governance forum, and that we need to think about that in terms of what we want a digital society to be, how we want to shape that, the sort of digital society we'd like to live in, not just the kind of internet we want. So it's a different frame of thinking.
David,
and my last point is that I don't think that we can go through another year without discussing Brexit.
There was no mention of Brexit in the morning, but I think that it started the afternoon, but we actually did steer quite clear of it for most of the day, which is a breath of fresh air. But what we did touch on a number of times is people asking for things, for enforcement, for things to be enforced. And you mentioned AI. Should we use artificial intelligence to enforce standards and things? Is that doable? Should we get machines to finally run the internet and run our services?
as you must have noticed from knowing me for so long, I'm essentially a pessimist. so, so no, I think, I mean, no, and I think that interface between human control, human decision-making as the essential point, and what we do with artificial intelligence is a really fundamental one, but the core to it has to be how we ensure that we are still in, that we don't cede too much decision-making power in a way that that makes it impossible for us to shape the society we want to live in.
Okay, one running joke was that if AI can't do it, then blockchain will do it, probably. But anyway, let's open the floor. Let's have some of your feedback and your insights and thoughts about how the day went and how we have to think in the future.
Thank you very much. We got through today until the very last few minutes when we had the two B words, Brexit and blockchain. I mean, that's quite a lot to kill off the day.
Had to be said.
So as somebody who's just been doing the ISO, part of the team doing the ISO evaluation, security evaluation of consensus mechanisms on blockchain and DLT, the number one thing we come back with, and I'm including discussions in Parliament here, discussions in parts of government, industry, is executive awareness. The biggest problem that we face is that the people that convert money to capability that affect our daily lives in whatever way do not understand the broad implications of what's going on here. And it's not just the technology, it's critically about the data. Most of the issues in terms of impacts are in the data space and how the data executes, whether you want to talk about takeover of BMW cars or whatever it may be. So I think today, coming back on the lessons and so on, my big plea is really to start looking at some of the data issues. And there was a sidebar discussion about protocols, because one of the biggest issues we faced internationally was the consequence of the Avalanche criminal network takedown, when we identified 800,000 fake organizations that had domain names. And to this day, in 3 IGF meetings, and I'm talking internationally, we've still failed to get on the table the issue of how we have the notion of trusted domains that we can bind to organizations, that we can bind to trusted business activity. Now, this is not just about protocols, it's bigger than that. And I defer to other more qualified engineers in the room than I. But I would ask to come back is we must look ahead in a year's time more seriously, if not before. And I'm putting, asked to put the challenge down from IGF, Council of Europe, Interpol, because that's where these discussions have been. What are we in the UK going to do about starting to help improve bits of the internet? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any further comments? Okay, the person at the back and then gentleman at the front.
Hi, so I'm here in my capacity as somebody working on a research project for future emerging technologies. And I'd be very interested in your perspective, because what I perceive is that the discourse has moved on from, say, 5 years ago, where the main discussion was surrounding norms, particularly norms regulating the internet. Now the discussion's very much moved on towards new technologies that have developed sufficiently that we're starting to see significant impact, such as artificial intelligence, such as blockchain, Internet of Things. Like technologies that I wouldn't necessarily classify as emerging technologies, because they are sufficiently developed now that we're seeing global impacts. And I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on future technologies that are not so robustly developed and how they could potentially move the discourse away from these technologies and into more like the emerging realm of, the emerging cyber realm, particularly with regards to mixed reality, which I think, when it is robust, will open up a whole new can of worms in terms of security, in terms of how the digital manifests in our normal lives.
Okay, thank you. Do we have 2 hours? 2 more hours? Perhaps no. Okay. We'll, so all of this is recorded, by the way, so this is stuff which we'll get Nick to answer next week sometime.
Okay, Philip Virgo here again. I was very struck by one of the comments from Stephen Patterson about how the focus of ARM had moved on from intrusion detection to intrusion prevention, and from isolating when suspect to proactively attack hunting. And it's one of the things that that move from reactive protection and prevention to actually cooperation in identifying who's organizing the attacks and removing them. And that raises all sorts of tricky issues that people have run away from for decades. And I think the time has come to take a really good look at active cooperation in taking out the predators.
So we're back to enforcement.
We're back to enforcement. We're back to acting on the 700,000 fake organizations. So what do we actually do proactively? And all of the very tricky issues that come up in governance, in jurisdiction, and so on, when you're cooperating internationally on that.
Thank you, Philip. Next, the gentleman in front, and then Khaled after that. And anybody else?
Alp from NetBlocks. So perhaps a happy note to end on, maybe something of an after note, but in March 2020, unless something happens, 300,000 UK registered EU domains are going to be, it seems, either deleted or rapidly dropped from the global domain system. And this looks like it could be one of the greatest single losses of human knowledge in a single moment in the history of humanity. And it's, there's a lot on the plate today, but it's certainly something I would like to discuss perhaps after at drinks and try to figure out what can be done in terms of policy to stop this disaster from happening.
Thank you. And I know a few people around the room are interested in this as well. So, Khaled?
Thank you. Khaled Fatal, MLI Group. It's really a reflection point. And I think if I take stock, we always take stock after IGFs, of this particular IGF event in the UK. Traditionally, it's about IGF issues. Well, today, the IGF was only a small component addressing IGF and ITU plenipotentiary, but at the same time, we talked about the threat landscape. I think it's important to reflect upon and take this from a philosophical point of view, the days when IGF was created as a subsequence to the WSIS in 2005, and I was involved in that process, by the way, is a different day from where we are today. And I think we may need to take a stronger look at the Macron call as to how to become relevant with IGF. And I take it back again, maybe one step back, is the relevance on what we do next, whether it's IGF or something else, because it is about the global threat landscape. It's about the threat, as one of the people who mentioned earlier on, that it's a threat to humanity. And unless we really look at what is it we're trying to accomplish, making society safer, making people safer, then at least we start looking at what the solutions next, not necessarily from the narrow perspective of what IGF stands for, whether it should stay like this or change. It's about addressing the issues that are of today, that are, when you look at WSIS and the days when IGF was created, well, guess what? Those were dinosaur days in comparison to where we are today. So it's a philosophical thought of reflection for everybody to think, how do we mitigate the new threat landscape? That's my point.
Thank you, Khaled. Any other points? David, you've been taking some notes. Do you wish to comment on some of the points made?
Well, I'd say maybe it's my chance to be provocative. But, I mean, I think in the first case, I think those who innovate have a responsibility to think about the risks of what they are creating, as well as the opportunities that there are in those things that they create. And obviously opportunities are much more fun to think about and much more exciting and they make you feel good and so forth. But there are many, many cases in the past where it's not necessarily that the innovation turned out to be a bad innovation. It's just that it could have been a better one and could have delivered a better set of outcomes if the risks had been thought about in advance more effectively, minimized and mitigated. And I think there is a responsibility on technology innovators to do that. In terms of the proactive and reactive response, I mean, I also was very struck by that particular point that was made in the last session. And I kind of, in my mind, went through how do we think about health? Preventive measures in healthcare are clearly more effective in the long-term social value than reacting to illness when it occurs. So prevention is an important part of this, and we need to think around that. With in terms of the IGF, I think that President Macron's speech was a really important contribution to this. And there's a sense in which I've attended every IGF. I was at the 2 World Summits. I did the 5- and 10-year reviews of the World Summit for the UN. So the IGF has been a kind of I've kind of absorbed it over many years. And I feel there is a sense in which it's still a very valuable forum. And I learn a lot at it, and it's really useful. But it's also, to some extent, a safe space for internet insiders. And I think it needs to be more challenging than that. So I think what Macron was talking about was challenging. And I was a bit disappointed by some of the reactions I heard to it subsequently, which were along the lines of, oh, he doesn't understand what the IGF's about. I think he does. He was saying, I do understand what you're trying to do, and I think it should be different, and that's a legitimate and important perspective.
But there was some concern about replacing a multi-stakeholder model with more multilateral processes. And I did listen to the speech in French, and there was no problem with translation or interpretation as such. It was multilateral and multi-partie prenante, which is multi-stakeholder. So how do you deal with that?
But I think, and this is one of the points I was trying to make earlier, that I personally think that we need to rebalance that relationship. That what was viable as multi-stakeholder when the internet was small and did not have colossal impact on economy, society, and culture is different to what is viable as multi-stakeholder today. And the engagement of governments within processes is clearly essential. So I'm kind of thinking around the ways in which we can evolve multi-stakeholder processes that bring in those governments, including those governments that are hostile to them, in new ways of looking forward. So I think that we do need to rethink that, and that was the message I got from it. But my French is not good enough to have seen it in French.
Any other comments from the room? Yes, please.
I'm not sure if this was addressed earlier in the day, but perhaps on this side of the Atlantic we could review how the US FCC's repeal of the Obama-era net neutrality bills have gone a year down the line, seeing as they've only come into effect as a course of this summer. So it might be something that would be worth looking at in the next session.
Okay, thank you for this. I think that, and I'm probably speaking out of my depth, but I think that it is actually network neutrality is ingrained in the European laws for telecommunications. But of course, if you mention the B word, Brexit, what happens afterwards? That's an interesting question there as well. Christian? Oh, where's the mic gone? Yeah, you put your hand up.
Christian Laranaga. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I have some sympathy for what David was saying about the rebalancing between multilateral and multi-stakeholderism. There's never been a comfortable space about defining how multi-stakeholderism should work globally or locally. Our government here is definitely takes consultations, but isn't allowing people from the bottom to make policy decisions, at the coalface. So I think that there needs to be some rethinking as to how do we reframe that debate and allow participation from all parties, in a more open way. I think we're in a situation at the moment where a lot of a lot of consultation happens in lobbying, in private and in dark rooms. And that also happens in multi-stakeholder forums like ICANN and other places as well. So if you don't go to a few, you tend to lose out as to actually what the debate is happening, and you have to keep your ears to the ground. And I think there is a balance here to be had between people who can't go to these multi-stakeholder type forum, but have a stake in it, in the outcome, and the role of their governments and other places to, to address the gaps. My real question, though, was a question really of one thing that didn't come up today, as far as I knew, was this application layer centralization that's been going on the internet in the last 10 to 15 years. The American behemoths, for instance, the Googles, the Amazons, and so forth. And the same thing happening in China, but by being protected by their firewall commercially. And the movement in Europe, which is the new next generation internet of the European Union, which is coming on stream next year, potentially, to look at how to rebalance a European sector to bring up European champions in each of the various areas. This is counterbalanced with what Tim Berners-Lee and others are saying with the web application, which has dominated the internet for the last few years, being too centralized, and there's a big movement now to decentralize that as well. And we're also at the cusp of something very interesting, which has been alluded to a few times. Patrick's mentioned his work in blockchain. I think a lot of us have been working in that area. There's also areas in artificial intelligence, which has been covered in some detail here today, and also in Internet of Things. There's also areas in new mobile technologies coming on stream, and all these new factors are going to be incredibly difficult to unpick as to the influence of where things go, I think. At least I find it a struggle. And so if we're looking at 5G, for instance, there's a lot of marketing talk, very little understanding as to how stakeholders from SMEs, individuals, universities, whoever, can really understand how they can use these things. So I think in the future IGF function, I think in the UK, which is very prominent in terms of its policy, in terms of looking at 5G and these technologies in Silicon Glen and all these other places, I think it would be very instructive for us to try to bring those issues more up the agenda for a future IGF. I'd be interested to know what people think about that.
Okay. Anyone else?
Can I just say that these are really good questions. I don't want to leave them hanging. To quote myself, we're wasting valuable drinking time now. So, can I just wrap up, really just say a huge thank you to the final panelists, to all the panelists, to all of you for attending, for all the remote participation, and I think it's been a really valuable and interesting day. We'll do a write-up and circulate that as well, but on behalf of the committee, huge thank you to the team for the events and also to the Cavendish Centre staff as well. It's been fantastic, absolutely great. So, thank you.
Of course, all the people that have come here for today's IGF. So hopefully we'll see you next year, and we'll follow up on the mailing lists and on the website. So thank you.